Whatever happened to the term Asperger's? You don't hear Asperger's or Aspie used very much these days. So why is that? It used to be really, really common. Is it still a thing? Why don't we use it so much anymore? And make sure you stick around until the end of the video where I'll share my own personal reasons about where I've landed in terms of the word Asperger's and Aspie in my own life. Hi everyone, Paul Micallef here from Autism from the Inside. I make weekly videos sharing the human side of autism, so make sure you hit subscribe to get the latest content. When I discovered my own autism about 10 years ago now, Asperger's was the term most commonly used to describe people like me. In fact, the book, the memoir that I read that led me to my own self-discovery was called Look Me in the Eye, My Life with Asperger's. The first online test I did on myself is called the Autism Quotient test, which is from a study published back in 2001 that has the official title of the Autism Spectrum Quotient, Evidence from Asperger's Syndrome, High Functioning Autism, Males and Females, Scientists and Mathematicians. When the results of my official internet diagnosis was probably, there's a high chance you should probably look into this, I looked for a local support group and found Asperger's Victoria. And when I wanted to learn more about this stuff, I went to my local library and borrowed what was essentially the Bible of this kind of stuff at the time, Tony Attwood's The Complete Guide to Asperger's Syndrome. And after all that, when I decide this is such a big revelation for me in my life that I want to start a blog and a YouTube channel, I choose the name Asperger's from the Inside, which you'll see on basically all of my older videos before I updated to Autism from the Inside a little while back. So you get the sense of just how common this term was 10 years ago. Everyone knew it was a type of autism, and we were always using the word autism as well. But it just seemed so convenient and natural to refer to what we're talking about as Asperger's instead of autism. These days, however, 10 years later, you'll hardly hear it at all. Yes, some people still use it, some older groups still have it in the name, but in terms of official settings and in research and in organizations, service providers and things like that, even within the autism community, we just hardly use that term at all, especially compared to how commonly it was used almost all the time 10 years ago. So what happened? Well, I'm glad you asked. You're in the right place. In fact, I've prepared an entire video on it, which we are currently doing right now. So I probably didn't need to tell you that. There are three major factors that I've identified as to why that term has fallen out of favor, and let's go through them now. Number one, the first reason that the term Asperger's has fallen out of favor is due to an update in the diagnostic process. So for a while, the term Asperger's was an official diagnosis category. In other words, many people were diagnosed with Asperger's as opposed to autism. I won't go into the history, but essentially Asperger's was considered to be like a type of autism alongside other types of autism like high-functioning autism or classic autism or other diagnostic terms that were used at the time to try and be a little bit more specific about what type of autism we meant by the diagnosis. Then in 2013, the DSM-5 was released, and it essentially combined all the previous types of autism under the umbrella of ASD, Autism Spectrum Disorder. And then under that relatively generic term, you could add additional information to be more specific, for example, describing the level of support needed in various areas, if there's an accompanying language delay, and things like that. So this was a change in the professional medical diagnostic process, but it didn't really stop people using the term Asperger's in everyday life. I mean, it's kind of useful to specify a little bit more about what you mean when you say autism, given that the spectrum is so diverse. So for a while in the community, the word just kept getting used and we kind of just ignored the fact that it wasn't technically a diagnostic label anymore. As Tony Attwood used to say, the term Asperger's will still be around and still be used colloquially because I have ASD level 1 no language delay doesn't quite have the same ring to it. There was also a level of identity here. We are in a period of autism acceptance where there's still a lot of stigma and we're slowly transitioning from an entirely deficit-based model to the kind of autism that you can actually be proud of. So for a lot of people, embracing that Aspie identity was a really positive thing. They're not about to just change their own identity overnight just because a bunch of psychiatrists in the US decided to modify the terminology of the official diagnostic process. Over time, however, less and less people were getting the word Asperger's on their diagnosis, which means as more and more children, more and more adults are being diagnosed and or discovering their own autism, the percentage of the autistic community with an emotional attachment to that older term is getting less and less over time, which means that today, anyone diagnosed in the last 5 years or so probably doesn't use that term anymore. And so everyday usage is slowly becoming less and less prevalent. Okay, number 2, the second reason we don't use the term Asperger's as much as we used to is controversy within the autistic community. If you're not aware of this already, the issue can probably be understood best as the tension between being united and being divided. So the word Asperger's, the whole concept of having subcategories of autism, is inherently divisive within the community because you're breaking up the community, you're separating out the community into these subcategories. So there's pros and cons to doing that, obviously, but the opposite is more like a unifying push to recognize our similarities rather than trying to separate into subgroups based on our differences. Ultimately, where the majority of the community has landed on that is that it's more important and more beneficial for us to focus on uniting and what are we share in common than letting ourselves fight with each other, basically, on the things that we disagree with. Now, initially, this urge to be more specific kind of makes sense. And for someone like me, for example, when I discovered the subcategory of Asperger's, it made a lot of sense to me personally because I wasn't trying to identify with the entire autism spectrum. I was trying to identify with a certain subset of people that were a lot more like me rather than the entire diversity of the entire community, which was much, much easier to do. There was also a significant amount of imposter syndrome, for lack of a better word. Do I belong here? Is it okay that I'm in this space? Is it okay that I'm using this autism label or this Asperger's label on myself? Does that take away from someone else if I start using someone else's label? Or can I use it for myself and do I actually belong here? So it was a lot easier to say yes to those things when we had a really specific term for that. Now, that tendency led a lot of people and still leads a lot of people to say things like, I have Asperger's as opposed to I have autism, especially earlier on in the journey. It may also lead people to say things like, I have mild autism or I have high functioning autism. And there are some significant problems with using those types of language, and I've actually done an entire video on that. However, it makes sense from an individual's perspective. Am I really a part of this group? Am I taking away from someone who is objectively significantly more disabled than I am by using their label for me? So in that sense, it's an attempt to be respectful of someone else's label rather than just taking it on for myself. But at the same time, it can be quite divisive within the community because the unconscious message is, I'm not like you, I'm like this group of people and I'm not like those group of people over there. So one way that this played out was the Aspie Supremacy concept or movement, where people previously shunned from society as being somewhat defective now embrace this term Asperger's and this identity as an Aspie and kind of reframe that as we are the next evolution of the human species and everyone else is dumb and not developed enough. Hopefully, I don't need to dwell too much on why that is problematic for lots of reasons. It makes sense like a reaction, like an overreaction. You've said I'm not as good as you, and I'm going to react to that by saying, actually, I'm even better than you. But when we take a step back from that and actually look at that a little bit more objectively, being autistic does not make you better than the rest of the population. So sentiments like that have fueled this desire as a community to come together and say, we are all autistic, we're all in the same boat, we all share something and we can kind of understand each other. And at the same time, it still makes it quite hard to describe, well, what do I actually mean when I say autism? How do I appropriately share my skills and my talents and what I'm good at and all my struggles and areas where I might legitimately be disabled, all in the one thing in a way that people can understand. And so actually part of the reason we're moving away from subsets of autism is because when we do those subsets, it's a bit simplistic and they don't adequately describe the depth and the diversity that exists not only within the community, but within one person. So the classic way to understand this is if you say high functioning autism, you're kind of ignoring the struggles of that person. And if you say low functioning autism, you're kind of ignoring the capacity of that person. So very often people are extremely intelligent and gifted and face some pretty extreme challenges as well. I remember a friend of mine telling me how hard it was to find a good support worker for her son because he's extremely intelligent. He works in academia. He's very verbal. And he also needs 24/7 supervision, especially in public, because if you let him go to the toilet by himself, he will strike up a conversation with a stranger in a public toilet, and that is just not something that is often a good idea to do. So his complete obliviousness to even really, really basic social things mean that he is quite vulnerable and it's very dangerous for himself to leave him alone a lot of the time, hence needing a support worker to leave the house. But at the same time, he's also more intelligent than most of the population. Another related reason around this that we've started to use terms like Asperger's less and less is that there was a tension around the question of, can someone like me, for example, talk about autism and help people, especially parents, understand their children when their children don't seem to be very much like me? They have a different way of presenting their autism, and from the surface of it, it looks like we're quite different people. So surely we have different types of autism. And this type of thinking tends to dismiss the actually autistic input from the broader autism discussion. And I'm reminded Chris Bonello talks about this really well, basically saying, when I was a child and I couldn't speak and I didn't know what was going on for me, well, I couldn't advocate for myself. And now that I'm an adult and I've learned how to speak and I've learned about myself, you're not letting me share those insights on behalf of the children who can't speak for themselves yet. So that's a constant ongoing challenge within the community. But the general push is that if you're autistic, we kind of have a sixth sense of understanding other autistic people. And so it makes sense to all be on the same team and come together in terms of advocacy and things like that. So number 3, the third reason that we use Asperger's less and less these days is around the controversy is probably not the right word, but just the unpleasant history surrounding Hans Asperger, who Asperger's syndrome is named after. Very brief autism history lesson. Around the 1930s and 40s, autism was starting to be described by Leo Kanner in the US and Hans Asperger in Austria. So even if you don't have a degree in history, you may not be surprised that some pretty awful things happened under the watch of Hans Asperger. Now, over the years, people have painted this picture a little bit differently. Everything from making him out to be a saint, describing autism and what we used to call Asperger's in very positive terms, outlining the skills and talents of the children he was working with, essentially saving their lives because if they were viewed as disabled, they may well have been euthanized. Others say he was much more complicit than that, actively participating in the Nazi regime. I personally don't think either of those characterizations are either helpful or necessary. Even without trying to apportion blame, we know lots and lots of really bad things happened. It was a particularly ugly part of history, and that's more than enough for the term Asperger's to lose its appeal for a lot of people. So when you put those 3 big factors together, we've got a change in the official diagnosis, an emphasis on unity within the autistic community, and unpleasant associations with the man we get the name from. It kind of makes sense that Aspie and Asperger's is used much, much less these days. But where is it still used? Is it appropriate? Is it offensive? Should we actively stop using it? Should we bring it back? Firstly, where are you most likely to still see the term? It's going to be in either old names, which existed prior to the shift that started in 2013. It's going to be from older people who were diagnosed as having Asperger's prior to 2013. And it's going to be from people generally towards the start of their autism journey who need a stepping stone. And it's a little bit too hard to go from I thought I was normal to I'm autistic. And it's a lot easier to go from I thought I was normal to wow, I found this group of people who identify as Asperger's. And that's a really cool thing and positive thing for me. And I haven't quite made the link between that and the rest of the autistic population yet. So it's like a significant step in the autistic self-discovery process. So if you're wondering what terms to use and when, I actually did an entire video on autism language. But the short answer is, in general, there are newer, better, more socially appropriate, more generally accepted terms to use these days, which means older terms like Aspie and Asperger's with all of their history and potentially some baggage sometimes are probably not as good to use unless you're really familiar with the history and the nuance of what you're trying to say. And as usual, individuals get to decide how they identify as themselves. So if you really like that term for yourself, then I would encourage you to do what works for you, because after all, it's a self-discovery process, not about conforming to what people around you think you should be doing. So what about me personally? Well, I've already shared a bit about my early journey and adopting Aspie and Asperger's as an identity for myself at the time. And since then, I have come along the journey that I've been describing in this video. I've connected more and more to others in the autistic community. I've had a better understanding of the diversity within the autistic community, and even people that seem very, very different to me. I can start to see what our similarities are and how we can still all be under this one autistic banner. And so naturally, I'm inclined to use the term less and less. And now I feel like the term autistic fits me better. And now when I go back and try and call myself an Aspie, I'm like, look, it's all right, I guess, but it just doesn't quite fit. It doesn't quite feel as good as it used to. And so that's why I updated the channel name a little while back. And now Autism from the Inside feels a lot more on point to match my own personal journey. So I think that's probably the most important thing, recognizing that it is a journey and it is a personal journey. I've heard feedback from a lot of people who really like the term Asperger's. They're like, why did you get rid of that? You know, if you didn't have Asperger's in your name, I never would have found your YouTube channel. I never would have found my tribe. I never would have gone on this whole discovery process at all. So that kind of makes sense. And that's why I encourage people to follow their own personal journey. But ultimately, to answer the question in the very beginning of the video, this is my analysis of why I see Asperger's and Aspie being used less and less in the community these days. So I'd love to hear what you think. Have you noticed similar things to what I've been describing? Is it different in your part of the world? Please leave a comment if you can. I'd love to hear from you. If you like this video and you'd like to support this channel, you can join our Patreon community for as little as $1 a week. So please consider that if you're able. It makes a big difference to ensuring I can keep doing this work. Otherwise, thanks for watching. I hope you liked this video and I'll see you again next week. Bye.